Okay, here's our interview with Sarah Wynne. Why don't you just kind of start with, a brief primer on Soviet Union and poison? Who did Lenin? Did Stalin started? Did Lenin started? Was it did the Tsar, were the czars using poison? Does this have a long history in Russia slash Soviet Union?
In a strange twist of fate, both Lenin and Stalin were poisoned themselves, despite starting what's called Laboratory One in around 1921. It was a lab specializing in literally killing of individuals. They had a group called Special Tasks that would either kill people within Russia that were inconvenient for Stalin, or white Russian immigrants who had left and refused to return. So it was often done secretly, and they would celebrate actually if they would test people. They call them rabbits, and there was an adjoining prison called the Lubyanka, and they would bring people and even interviewed poisoners from Auschwitz, Nazi poisoners, and they would try to find ways to poison people where it would look like a natural death. So if you, for instance, suffered from a heart condition, they would give you potassium. They said, oh, well, he died of a heart condition. Or we believe, for instance, Anna Pavlova was killed with anthrax. Anthrax would mimic pulmonary diseases. And so they send these test rabbits off for autopsy. And if the doctors doing the autopsy said, well, it looks like they died of natural causes, then they would rejoice.
And when you say test literally rabbits.
They actually started off with animals and learned that animals didn't give them the results that they wanted. So they actually called their test rabbits birdies, and they were humans. Humans they would pull from the Lubyanka.
Wow.
It was really
what's the Lubyanka?
That was the prison I was just mentioning that was back in Stalin times. The Lubyanka and Lab 1 were connected underground via tunnels.
Wow. But you're saying it actually started under Lenin?
We think probably around 1921, 22, it started.
Mm-hmm.
And then Stalin was the main face of it, however.
And give us a ballpark number of how many people you think Stalin poisoned.
That's a really good guess. When I started researching this, I thought Hitler was the worst killer that had ever lived. And Stalin killed tens of millions of people. I don't think we can even accurately know the number.
Give us a little quick summary of Stalin's reign and so on, because his name is coming back up today. John mentioned that his photo or depiction is on buses now in Moscow. You've got Putin supposedly resurrecting Stalin to some extent. So what are the key things people need to know about Stalin?
Interestingly, he didn't start off as a villain. He was born in 1878, I believe, and went to parochial school. His mother was named Kiki. He loved her dearly. She was deeply religious, but his father was very abusive. He was an alcoholic and would often beat them. And he would, when he would lose his job, he'd leave for years at a time. And but with help, his mother got him into parochial schools, and actually he went to seminary, believe it or not. But within 4 years, he discovered Marxism as his religion. He was kicked out of the seminary. He even, an interesting story, on his mother's deathbed, he told her, "Mom, I've become the czar," and she said, "It would have been much better for you if you'd become a priest." So unfortunately, he didn't follow in her footsteps.
So was he instrumental in the revolution along with Lenin?
I think so. He actually his successes began when he became Lenin's assistant, and Sverdlov was Lenin's chief of staff at the time, and he did not like Stalin. Interestingly, Sverdlov died of lung poisoning shortly thereafter. It was one of Stalin's first attempts to rise. He saw that the accretion of power Stalin had was not a good thing, but Stalin learned of it and killed him. And then Stalin became Lenin's secretary and rose up the ranks from there.
And walk us through Stalin's greatest atrocities.
Oh man, that's a hard question. I think it would be his establishment of Laboratory One, and then also a group called the Yasha Gang that ran out of Paris. They were notorious killers that would kill secretly in these Liternoy killings. We allege in the book I believe for the first time that Anna Pavlova was killed by Stalin. There are over 40 biographies of Anna Pavlova, and we couldn't find anyone else attributing her death to Stalin, despite her saying, "I've been poisoned by the food I ate in Paris."
And before we get into her poisoning and some of the others, the tens of millions that you say Stalin killed, tell us about that.
Well, there are many examples. He followed a doctrine called cultural hegemony. And so he realized to control, or he believed to control man, he needed to also to control the arts and theater and the minds of man. And so he would kill artists that didn't agree with his philosophy. Pavlova was one. She loved the imperial ballet and imperial Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. So she was an example of someone who had to be killed. Another thing, he destroyed the great Cathedral of Christ the Savior. It was another symbol of old Russia, imperial Russia. Interestingly, it was rebuilt exactly the same between 2000 and 2005. But those are examples of he wanted to kill people. Another famous example under his cultural hegemony policy was his killing of the Kobzars. These were roaming musicians that played on the Ukrainian steppes for years, hundreds of years. And he summoned them all together, 300 of them, pretending to create a union to help them, and he shot them all and killed them and buried them in a grave. So lost was their wonderful music, on the steppes.
But how do we get to tens of millions? Is that through the famine, or what was the primary way?
He also initiated famine in the Ukraine. He seized the grain stocks, and so famine in Ukraine was a huge way that he did that.
Right. So, okay, tell us about Anna Pavlova. And how she rose to a position where Stalin would want to kill her.
She was declared an enemy of the state. And you think, why would a beautiful ballerina be declared an enemy of the state, and why would Stalin care? But she represented this old Russia that he couldn't stand. He wanted the new Marxist Russia and the imperial Russia of the Romanovs to be gone. She actually she was 5 feet tall, not the traditional ballerina, and rose up through the imperial ballet with Marcus Petipa, her mentor. She then danced with the ballet russe with Sergei Diaghilev, who we also allege was killed by Stalin. And then when Diaghilev began diverting from the traditional ballet, she left and started her own ballet. She traveled 400,000 miles before air travel, which is pretty remarkable. She said her prayer was her dance, and she wanted to seed the world with ballet. So she was just an image of old Russia that Stalin couldn't tolerate.
So when was she born?
She was born in, let me see. She was born, I need to go back and look, within 3 years of Stalin's birth, I believe. I'll have to go back.
Okay.
We have all of this in the
So
book.
she was already, even before the revolution, she was known.
Yeah, well, she actually made a name for herself. She was a student with Petipa in the Imperial Ballet. And then in the Great Ball of 1903, the Winter Ball, which was a famous ball that the Romanovs put on every year to celebrate the new year and also their reign. It was consisted of many days of parties, the Masquerade Ball being the largest. But she actually opened the Winter Ball dancing Swan Lake under Petipa's instruction. She graduated there from student to famous ballerina. Her career took off from there, and that was really the beginning of the end of the imperial reign of the Romanovs. Was she so big that she would have been known even in the United States? Oh, definitely. She traveled here actually and danced with the Houston Ballet. I'm from Houston. So she visited 44 countries.
Okay. So she would be like Baryshnikov is who I think of today as a Russian dancer that became world known.
Actually, she had many friends in Hollywood, and she starred in one film, The Dumb Girl of Porcini, but a film after her death a year later was called Grand Hotel. It won the Academy Award in 1932 for Best Picture, and it was modeled after a Russian ballerina, many think Pavlova. Okay,
so she was a major celebrity in Russia then, obviously.
She was. Russia and the rest of the world. She escaped she wasn't in Russia during the revolution. At that time, she had a home in London called the Ivy House, where she really was a wonderful person inside and out. She developed an orphanage, a school for orphans. She tutored for very little money rising ballerinas. She had a foundation that was later taken by Stalin and proceeds given to the Red Army. But she was a wonderful person and stood for everything Stalin couldn't tolerate.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't familiar with her until I noticed your guys' book. So the fact that so many biographies have been written about her, tell us a little bit about what makes her so special besides just being a famous ballerina.
Well, like I was saying, she was so tiny. She's not who you would look at initially and think, my goodness, that's the most wonderful ballerina I've ever seen. But Petipa taught her that her weaknesses were actually her strength. So her frailty and her tenderness. And she had a way of possessing really spirituality through her dance, not just her face, but her body. And she became world famous for it. No one has ever really been able to touch it. What's really neat also is she danced this dance called the Dying Swan that she danced over 4,000 times. And although Pavlova has been dead for 90 years, when we were preparing, we have a book launch coming up and we're preparing a PowerPoint presentation. We actually end it with, I believe it's 34 ballerinas from around the world dancing the Dying Swan for COVID relief. So nice. It's like a tree that burns down but plants seeds, or the butterfly effect, the flapping of wings. So she's gone, but she lives on in the minds of many people who love her and admire her.
Mm-hmm. So what I failed to do that I should have is just, I usually will like read the Wikipedia on somebody. So I should have read the Wikipedia on it, because I'm really not that knowledgeable about her. But her world acclaim was primarily just as essentially the most famous ballet dancer ever, essentially.
Arguably, I think many would say that. She also took ballet. She viewed it as her mission to bring ballet around the world. And one of her most famous, maybe objectively her best dance of the 4,000 times she danced the Swan, was in Mexico in 1919. The Mexican Revolution was going on. Carranza had taken control. The revolutionary Zapata had just been killed. The American Council said, "We advise you heavily, do not go to Mexico. This is not safe for you." And she traveled anyway with 200 armed guards on top of her train. And she danced. The venue they chose for her was the famous Bull Ring, to bring classical ballet for the first time to Mexico. As she did it by torchlight. And surprising her as she started to dance, Pablo Casal, which was at the time the most famous cellist, rose from the crowd and played for her. And so it was really a spectacular presentation. Her company at the end had choreographed a dance in point shoes to the Mexican hat dance, which traditionally had been shunned by the upper classes, but they loved it, and it became the national dance of Mexico after that. She went to Australia, and Strawberries Pavlova was named for her. She danced with elephants in Germany. She posed in front of the Great Sphinx. She traveled everywhere and was loved by everyone she met.
Has there been a film made about her, or
not a feature film, not that I'm aware of. No,
just documentaries.
Correct.
Right. And was she political in any way?
She initially during the revolution, she initially sympathized with the revolutionaries, but then left Russia and understood the danger and stayed out of Russia.
And so why did she become a target of Stalin in your guys' view?
Well, because she represented everything he couldn't stand. He wanted to, when he destroyed the church of the cathedral, the great cathedral I was telling you about with the golden dome, he also destroyed at the same time something called the Gate of Resurrection. And people had prayed there for 400 years, entering Red Square. At the time, Stalin said, we don't need a gate of resurrection, because by 1937, the word God itself will be removed from the Russian vocabulary. And she represented religion and freedom and everything that he wanted to suppress.
And Stalin was no fan of the arts. Is that what you're saying?
No, he was a fan. He was actually a singer and somewhat of a poet himself, but he was a fan of the arts as long as it could be used as an instrument of the state. Art for art's sake, beauty for beauty's sake, he couldn't tolerate that. And so he actually sent a woman named Alexandra Kollontai. She was the ambassador to Norway. He sent her to Norway to try to stop her 1931 tour. They laughed at her and said, "No, we're not going to do that." She was an awful character. She believed children belonged to the state, etc. But by sending Kollontai to stop Pavlova, that clearly came from the top ranks, and he saw her as an enemy that he had to get rid of.
So she was not supporting the revolution and the new communist government, but she wasn't, it sounds like she wasn't necessarily speaking out against it.
Well, she was, in the sense that she was defying Stalin. She wasn't returning when asked to return. She was, and actually in 1925, Stalin sent her mother, who had been missing for 7 years, sent her to London to try to recruit Pavlova back. It was an operation called Operation Trust, where they were trying to recruit white Russian immigrants back to Russia, and there they would either be exploited or killed. She said, "I'm not going back." Her mother, against Pavlova's wishes, did go back and was never heard from again.
Mm. So where was she when she died, and what year was it?
So that was in 1931. She was in Paris preparing for her 1931 tour. She was, despite being 5 feet tall, she was very brave. She was preparing to go to dance in Poland, right on the border. So she wasn't afraid, but she had lunch in her hotel room in Paris and then boarded a train for the Netherlands. She was to dance at The Hague, and she became ill on the train. And she even said, "I've been poisoned by the food I ate in Paris." And no one took her seriously. They treated her for pleurisy. They drained her lungs. They did other things that just didn't work. And at the time, though, Yash's gang, the group I was telling you about that operated out of Paris secretly, their antics, awful antics, wouldn't be known for 60 plus years. So in their defense, when she said, "I've been poisoned in Paris," that wasn't a likely thing that the doctors would have suspected had happened.
Mm-hmm. And how old was she at that time?
She was, 49 years old.
Wow. So she was dancing at a
pretty old
advanced age. Yeah,
I know it. She, at the time of her death, they were supposed to dance the next night in The Hague, and she called her company together and swore that they would continue to dance despite her dying. She asked for her swan costume, made the sign of the cross, and died. And then, true to their promise, the next night, they did perform, and when the dying swan was played, a spotlight shone on the stage where she would have been. The crowd was in tears. The King and Queen of Belgium were there in tears.
So I guess what you're saying is poisonings weren't necessarily well known at that time, so wouldn't have been highly suspected. They
weren't known at the time. No, it was more a tool of Stalin to get rid of inconvenient people. And actually, Pavlova's death was, if you want to say, executed perfectly, because having been poisoned in Paris and then boarded the train, all of the evidence, that they would have needed was in another city at the time. And it really was kind of the perfect crime.
Well, and is it also fair to say that people would naturally think of her as someone who would be targeted for poisoning?
The only reason it was possible is she had been declared an enemy of the state, which was not popular at the time. And after Kollontai was sent to talk to her, she in 1925, I believe, or no, probably 1930, to stop her tour in Norway. Pardon me. She spoke with a friend and said, "Please go to a Russian Orthodox church and pray for me. I feel a dark, heavy cloud like a sword of Damocles over my head." So I think she knew she was in trouble at that point, and friends of hers had died as well. And so I think that was another reason when she said, "I've been poisoned by the food in Paris." She saw it coming somewhat.
And I'm sorry, did you say that your book is the first to allege that her death was as a result of a poisoning?
That's my understanding. We read several biographies. We rely heavily on 3, but I believe there are over 40 biographies written. We have approximately 650 endnotes in this book. It has been researched so heavily, and no one else blames. There are a couple that mentioned she was poisoned. She said, "I was poisoned by the food in Paris," but no one tracks it back to Stalin.
So what did you guys discover that allows you to make that assertion?
looking at the Yasha gang and other people that he was killing at the same time in much the same way. One of such people was a man named Diaghilev, Sergei Diaghilev, who was neither a producer, dancer, or choreographer. He was a producer of the Ballet Russe. I don't know if you've heard of the Ballet Russe before, but it began in about 1909, 1910. He became probably the most famous ballet producer in the world at the time. They were very different in personality and temperament, although they both grew up in the Imperial Ballet. Diaghilev became famous for his outrageous performances. He was much like the Cirque du Soleil of today. He deviated from classical ballet that Pavlova loved so much. But he also was a genius at really discovering and pulling together remarkable talent. So George Balanchine and Lafar and Nijinsky and Coco Chanel designed the costumes. Pablo Picasso, Matisse designed the sets. It was a spectacular event that this whole experience, as we would say today, that he created.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, you're saying he was also poisoned?
Yes, he was poisoned in Venice. But again, it was intended to look like a natural death. He died of boils on his stomach that wouldn't heal. He was diabetic, but we think he was fed melitosis at the time, which was a disease that would mimic that. And we think that because melitosis was being weaponized at the time at the camps where his brothers and nephews were arrested and taken. He also was declared an enemy of the state after Lunacharsky, one of Stalin's top aides, approached him in 1925 and invited him to return back to Russia, an invitation he couldn't refuse. He said no. Lunacharsky came back and declared him an enemy of the state and an elitist. So it's much the same similar situation as we're seeing with Pavlova.
Right. And Pavlova was otherwise obviously in pretty good health at the time. She was about to go dance.
Yes. And they proposed, crazy, preposterous things about what could have led to her death. Some people said she had stood in the rain a couple of days earlier and that had led to it. Some people even said she had exercised in too cold of a room. But one person said it was from surgical instruments. She got blood poisoning when they were draining her lungs. But I think Pavlova knew at the time and announced how she'd been killed. And we're pretty certain that happened.
Yeah. So Stalin was prolific in these type of poisonings. You guys assert in the book. I'm curious because I want to bring it up to what Putin's been up to. So between Stalin and Putin, were there other leaders that were also engaging in this kind of stuff?
Really, under Gorbachev, the poison lab was shut down. And then Putin started it up again in large force. So our book is interesting. If you read the back jacket, you think, how does Anna Pavlova lead to COVID-19? It's quite a range. But it makes sense if you think about these Litternoi killings that began in 1921. Stalin was able to get around the nuclear stalemate by really developing these bioweapons that can be just as dangerous as a nuclear weapon. And with Putin, Stalin, and then especially Putin, they grew large scale. So the same Marxist Stalinist ideology, these labs spread to North Korea and to China. We know there are 14 biolabs in China right now. You hear often about the Wuhan lab, but we believe that the leak of COVID-19 actually happened from an adjacent military lab with top clearance that the WHO never got to inspect, and you really never know anything about it. It's very top secret. We know from defectors that people are working in those labs with the Wuhan lab, and we think largely that COVID-19 was hushed so much, the release of it, because they're working on much worse things than that. And they didn't want the origin to be traced back to Wuhan.
Yeah. Yeah. And John walked us through some of that in the interview yesterday, which was great. And the fact that the U.S. assisted in dismantling bioweapons labs, and then Putin started bringing them back. But
Right.
how do you connect poisoning with biolabs? Is it all kind of the same? Do they concoct their poisons in the bioweapons labs, or is it
It
a
is.
separate?
It is. They're related. So they're doing now doing gain of function testing and weaponizing these viruses. I think there's confusion sometimes today because you hear biolab and you think, oh, that's a horrible, terrible thing. But I believe there are 40,000 biolabs in the U.S. So anytime we get our blood drawn or taken, biolabs in themselves is a benefit of science and helps us. But the biowarfare labs, we're calling them, are the ones where they're doing the gain of function research to make Marburg or weapons out of Marburg or smallpox or something like that. That's what we're calling biowar labs. And that's what began under Putin, under Stalin, and is now raging under Putin.
Mm-hmm. So, how about between Stalin and Putin? Were any of the other leaders, Khrushchev, etc., were any of them known for poisonings?
They definitely knew what was happening. Yes, Khrushchev and Molotov were called to Stalin's dacha the night he died, actually. And Stalin was famous for ridding his top management. I think everyone dealt with Stalin very carefully. And he did it to continue the deniability of his actions. It happened first in 1938, and it's called the Great Purge, where he just got rid of his top management. And again in the 1950s, in what's called the Doctor's Plot, where his top management was accused of poisonings, and they had to testify to it, but weren't able to say that it was at Stalin's direction. But yes, Khrushchev and Molotov were there the night before he died. The story is that what we learned is they had dinner together. They allegedly watched a movie together. They stayed up drinking till 4 or 5 in the morning. And then the following day, on March the 1st, around 1 in the afternoon, a maid and a guard went into Stalin's room and found him on the floor, unconscious, soaked in urine. They notified Beria at the time, who was Stalin's second in command. And he said, he's fine. He's recovering from a night of hard drinking. They changed him, put him in his bed, didn't call doctors or anything. The following morning at 7 a.m., Beria finally sent doctors in to care for him. It was too late. He died on the 5th, on March 5th. But yes, they were all aware of the poisoning happening.
And there's some controversy about Stalin's death, right? It's only of late that people now believe that he was poisoned, or walk us through that.
Well, yes, we do believe he was poisoned by Beria. 2 reasons. Both, according to Molotov and Khrushchev, Beria himself said, "I've poisoned him." And then in Beria's trial, he said, "You should thank me. I avoided a nuclear war." So Beria says that he learned of Stalin wanting to create World War III with nuclear weapons, and that he saved the world by poisoning Stalin. We believe he did it with warfarin, which is now a rat poison, ironically, and appropriately. But it would cause internal bleeding, which would mimic his symptoms. And they treated it with leeches, which was exactly the opposite thing to do. But yes, we believe he was killed with warfarin, on Beria's own words.
Mm-hmm. And then what about Khrushchev during his reign? Is it believed that Khrushchev poisoned anyone while he was leading the Soviet Union?
We don't have much evidence of that. Gorbachev and Khrushchev, no. I think John may be able to tell you differently, but I believe it was Stalin, and then picked up again with Lenin. Mm-hmm. I know shut down with Gorbachev, but actually in the same location in Laboratory 1.
And do you subscribe to the belief that Putin kind of idolizes Stalin?
Oh, I think there's no doubt. In fact, Stalin's mentor, when he became prime minister in 2019, was asked, 1999, and Anatoly Sobchak, his mentor, was asked, "Tell us about Putin. What's your impression?" And his quote was, "Putin is the new Stalin." So I think, yes, that was widely recognized.
And I don't know how much you go into this in the book, but where do we stand on the body count now with Putin? How many people has he poisoned?
Much like Stalin. I don't know that we'll ever know those numbers. Many, many thousands.
how many would you say at this point are reported? It just seems like every about 6 months or so you hear about someone who was poisoned somewhere, and it's believed to have been Russia
Yes.
that did it.
Well, the other thing we're reading about often right now, I believe there have been 7 oligarchs who committed suicide in recent days. One, the most recent, is just horrific. A man in his villa in Spain was found hung, and his wife and child were killed with an axe and a knife that had been wiped clean. So, I mean, you're hearing things all the time. It may not be poison in itself, but there are also these Liternoy killings.
Mm-hmm.
And
what can you tell us about the Navalny poisoning? Because that's the one that seems to be getting the most attention right now. He's sitting in prison in Russia somewhere, and perhaps laying in wait in hopes that one day that people are able to oust Putin and maybe Navalny will take over.
Well, that would be, if history repeats itself, like Lenin was poisoned and Stalin was poisoned, that would be the hope, right? That someone from the inside would do it. Navalny sure is a brave man, and to be poisoned with Novichok and to come back and now be imprisoned, and it's a pretty remarkable. What a man! What a brave man! I doubt he will be. I don't think he'll see the light of day. Much like people in cheese China now that just disappear. Never to be seen of again. There are many surrounding the COVID-19 release. Dr. Lee, who was the whistleblower that announced the leak, died quickly. In addition to all the records being demolished, and people have a way of conveniently disappearing, both in Russia and China.
Yeah. China's been pretty prolific in doing the same thing. What is the connection between the two? I mean, obviously, both former communist countries, China still communist, and both using these same type of poisons to kill people.
They both called each other friends. I think that they are. They're both in violation of the 1972 Bioweapons Convention that outruled the use of bioweapons. We stopped at the time, allegedly kept working on our defense of bioweapons, but they saw that as a green light to go forward. And like I say, now it's well advanced. We even learned that the Russian military spends 1 of 5 days training in hazmat suits. And the only reason that they would do that would be so that they would be prepared in the event they used chemical weapons and their opponents would not, which is a very frightening thing, especially seeing how the U.S. handled the release of COVID-19. I don't think anyone would say we were prepared for that.
Has the U.S. sanctioned China in any way for these bioweapons labs that our intelligence says that they have?
That's a good question. In 2015, we stopped providing funding for them. We learned through their gain of function, performing on gain of function tests on these labs and increasing the virulence and deadliness of viruses. So 2015, we stopped giving them money, but I think more needs to be done. I think a large reason we wrote this book was to raise awareness of what's actually happening. I think a lot of people, I think of the monkeys hear no evil, see no evil. It's easier to be ignorant and not know what's happening. But man, if COVID-19 is any gauge, we need to be prepared for what is as dangerous as a nuclear attack, affecting our water, et cetera.
I don't know how expert you are on this gain of function issue, but it sounds like you're saying that gain of function research would only be used to create a bioweapon. I thought that there was some innocuous potential reason.
Well, with CRISPR tools and things like that, and I'll begin by saying, no, I'm not an expert on it, but with CRISPR tools and things like that, they can make terrible diseases. For instance, the Hunter Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that would be you take certain ethnicities and use, for instance, Jewish people. If their DNA shows signs, individual signs that are distinct from other people, that they would develop diseases to only target them. So it would be a way to wipe out certain races or ethnicities. that would be an example of a nefarious project.
Mm-hmm.
Called the Hunter.
Is there a benevolent reason to do gain of function? I thought that, one of the reasons is, oh, we're going to create potential viruses so we know how to address them, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, sure. That was the initial plan, is to test viruses, and so that we have vaccines, we have, ways to fight it if it's released. The problem falls in when you have these bio labs testing smallpox and other things like that, and their leaks. And that's why in 2015 it was shut down, because we realized it was too dangerous. The technology to do it actually came out of the University of North Carolina, I believe, that we shared with the Wuhan lab. Mm-hmm. But then when we realized the nefarious uses, then money was cut off in 2015.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any gauge on the ability of people around Putin to take him out the way you believe Stalin was taken out?
It's interesting. If you'll see pictures of him, he's at the end of a very long table. He doesn't let people get close to him. And kind of an interesting story about Stalin. Remember me telling you the night that he was killed and he had Molotov and Khrushchev there. He was at his favorite dacha that really became in his later age his permanent residence. It had a moat surrounding it. It had 2 fences with anti-aircraft weapons and 300 guards on top of it. And what felled him was a tiny poison. So I think it would be fitting and ironic and entirely plausible for Stalin to be taken out with poison as well. There have to be, and I think that's one reason these oligarchs are dying. Putin has to be facing people who disagree with his policies, and as he learns about them, he takes them out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not clear to me who is even allowed to be around him, right? I don't know if these oligarchs are around him. It seems like some of these high-level military leaders are probably around him occasionally, and I know that there's some former military leader that's already spoken out significantly. I forget his name regarding Putin. So,
in Stalin's later days, he was a very lonely man. He wouldn't let anyone around him, for fear of being killed by his friends.
Right. Yeah. I mean, other than that, I don't see. He seems to be pretty secure. Putin does in his position right now. Obviously, very hard to oppose him. You go out into the street, you're going to wind up in jail. His, security forces around him are very strong, but yet his popularity seems to still be high among the Russian people.
I can't imagine it would stay that way long, or I hope not. At any rate, yeah. I hope that one of his friends wises up and stops his atrocities.
Yeah. And what do you know about the poisoning of Navalny, as far as what poison was used and why and how he was able to survive it?
I think it was Novichok that he was poisoned with, and I think got hospital attention quickly enough to have care. But I think
what do you know about Novichok? I'm not familiar with it. It's a poison.
It is. I can't speak to Navalny's poisoning as much. The book focuses primarily on poisonings of Stalin, but I do know that is what he was poisoned with and received attention.
Is that a new form of poison that wasn't around in Stalin's era?
I don't remember studying that poison in Stalin's days.
What was Stalin using primarily?
He used potassium and curate for heart attacks. He used anthrax. He used melitosis. So he had quite an arsenal of his own.
And as you said, all of them designed to make it look like the person died of natural.
All designed to mimic natural causes. That's right.
Yeah.
To be able to keep denying his involvement. Yeah.
This Novichok poisoning that you're referring to doesn't seem to be one where you care about making it look natural, considering what
sometimes he didn't. That was interesting. I mean, these Litternoi murders that Miranovsky and Sergei Spiegelglass and all of these assassins that he employed in the Yasha group were so adept at doing. Sometimes Stalin, and I think also Putin, wants to make a statement. with a killing. I mean, we in the book talk about people being gunned down in the street. Professor Tikin and other people being gunned down in the street. So oftentimes it was done secretly, but if he wanted to make a point, then they did that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously Putin always denies it, but you kind of get the sense that he knows we know and he doesn't care.
That's happened for a long time. You'll remember Raoul Wallenberg, the ambassador, and Reagan famously slammed his hand on the table and said, "Where's Wallenberg?" He was treated as a birdie in Laboratory One and during this Stalin era and vanished. The Russians first denied having them, then said having them, but that he would be released soon, then went back and said, we don't have any trace of him. He did die in the Lab One, and they gave him, I'm forgetting the name of the poison, but it made his organs shrink. And it was an excruciating death. They're famous for performing autopsies immediately to get rid of any way of acknowledging that these people had been poisoned.
So the U.S. is adhering to the 1972 Treaty on Bioweapons, and we have nukes, but we don't have bioweapons. So what should the U.S. be doing about China's and Russia's bioweapons?
That's a good question. I saw last week 6 or 7 congressmen demanding more answers as to the cover-up of the COVID-19 virus. I think it starts with information, learning, making the world aware of what's happening, and then imposing incredible sanctions to make it stop. It's a very frightening problem. I think it's as frightening as nuclear war. Mm-hmm.
Well, and we need people like Elon Musk apparently to buy the social media companies so the word can get out, because that word was not allowed to be out on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook. You weren't allowed to say that this came from a lab, let alone is a bioweapon. I don't know. In fact, we'll all have fun with this because we put these up on YouTube. And let's see what YouTube does when we say that COVID was likely a bioweapon.
I encourage people to read the book. John and I are both lawyers, and I think present a pretty clear case if we were trying this case in court that COVID-19 was formed in a lab. We know that they had brought bats from the Himalayas called horseshoe bats who carry a virus that's 96.2% similar to COVID-19. There's a 3.8% difference. We've read that includes a furin cleavage site where this spike protein is held that doesn't exist in any other virus within this family. We've also learned that it's, I believe, 12 bars of RNA long exactly. That kind of precision just doesn't happen in the lab. You look at other circumstantial evidence. I think of res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. I mean, it was disclosed on the doorstep of the Wuhan virology lab. And I don't know, did you see the clip with Jon Stewart when he was asked, the comedian Jon Stewart?
Yeah, he was on late night television and saying, isn't it seem pretty obvious that
it does? And made the joke that if there was a leak in Hershey, Pennsylvania, we wouldn't say that a Hershey bean mated with a snowplow. We would look at the facts in front of us, see that the first patient came from there. They immediately deleted all evidence that would have been able to research it. The WHO came a year, WHO came a year later. All of the inspectors were appointed by Xi. They weren't allowed to visit the top secret level 4 military lab where we believe they were doing this testing. I mean, there's so many things that point to COVID-19 coming from the lab.
Yeah. Who else? Who's the most prominent person or doctor or expert, et cetera, that would you say is agreeing with your guys' theory?
I think many are agreeing now. Initially, they weren't, but
but specifically, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys are alleging that it was a bioweapon. I hear a lot of people saying it came from a lab, but I think you guys are saying that it came from the military lab and it was being developed as a bioweapon.
That's what we believe.
Right. So that not hearing many people say. I'm hearing a lot of saying it came from the Wuhan lab of virology. that it was accidentally
There was
escaped,
a lot,
perhaps.
there
But-
was a
but-
lot of connection between the two. And we've learned from people who have since left. Ken Allebeck, who wrote a book called Biohazards, some other people who have left defected, who have told us of what's happening in this military lab. This is all, we discuss it at length in the book and document it with many footnotes. But yes, it's not a presumption. We're learning that from people who have defected and who have worked there.
Mm-hmm. Well, the U.S. is going to have some tough decisions to make if this starts becoming well known and accepted that this is what happened, because there has to be some response. There has to be some retribution against China for this. And so far, there's been none.
Hopefully, that's correct. Hopefully, the demand last week from the congressmen and women for answers to the cover up. I mean, the world, the U.S. deserved that. Think about all of the thousands of people that have died. We deserve answers to why this cover-up theory was allowed to persist.
Right.
I think that's the first step, is getting the word out, and hopefully this book will do that.
Thank you again to our guest, Sarah Wynne. You can check out her book, The Dancer and the Devil, wherever you buy your books. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.